The Mysterious Cities of Gold anime series review. So this series I have fond memories of from my own childhood. However, I've discovered as an adult, talking to other people my age, that some people fondly remember this show and some people have never heard of it. You know, it's funny, you assume that what you remember from childhood, especially pop culture memories, are universal, that everyone your age has the same memories. But this is one of those things that not everyone remembers. I think partly the reason for that is it was on cable. It was on Nickelodeon from 1986 to 1990. And I think especially back in the 80s, not everyone had cable. I think nowadays maybe cable is more mainstream than it was back then. The other thing is, there was no toy line attached to this TV show. So it wasn't like He-Man or the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles where you saw the toys and you saw the commercials everywhere you went. Either you knew about the show when you were watching it, or you didn't. And if you didn't know about it, it wasn't like in your face. At least in my area, the TV show was, I believe, it was on in the early afternoon around like 2 o'clock or 2:30, which was right at the time when we were still in school. I mean, I think school finished up at 3 o'clock, which meant that I actually couldn't watch this show most of the time during the school year. It was only on weekdays. I remember watching it during summer vacation and, maybe like school holidays or something like that. But the majority of the school year, I actually couldn't watch this show. Those may be reasons why people who are my age, who lived through the 80s, maybe don't remember it. On the other hand, people who do remember it tend to remember this very fondly. Both Americans, but I've been living abroad and I've talked to people from Australia, people my own age or roughly my own age who very fondly remember this show, some of them, people from Britain. I guess it's one of those shows that not everyone remembers, but people who do remember it have fond memories of it. So let me give some brief background on this here. This show was a collaboration between Japanese studios and French studios to make an animated series. In the US, it was on Nickelodeon from 1986 to 1990. It also, it was in Australia and Britain and France, of course. It's an animated series which is based off the old Spanish legend of the Cities of Gold, which, you can look this up on Wikipedia, but I guess to just briefly talk about it. When the Spanish explorers first came to America in the 1500s, there was a legend that there was 7 cities of gold somewhere in the New World. There weren't, of course, it was just a legend, but it was a legend that briefly had currency with some of the Spanish explorers. And some of the Spanish explorers tried to find these cities of gold, and they hired Indian guides to take them to the cities of gold in the New World, or Native American guides. And I remember as a kid, even before I found out about this series, reading about this legend in the school library. So when I found out about this show, I could connect it to something I knew about from reading at school. And that to me increased the interest of the show, or increased like the sense of awe or mystery, that I knew it was loosely connected to a real historical legend or a real historical mystery. The show is 39 episodes. Why 39? Well, apparently that was a magic number needed for syndication on Japanese television. So they planned it out for 39 exactly. I was a bit surprised to learn that it was 39 episodes, actually. As a kid, it always seemed like longer to me. I never actually sat down and watched the whole thing. Well, right. I almost forgot the most important part. It was an ongoing story. So it wasn't like He-Man or Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or whatever, where each episode was its own self-contained story. The whole thing was one continuous story. So when you started off each episode, they would do like a recap, like last time on the mysterious cities of gold, and they'd fill you up where you were up to the story. And then it would start off immediately with where the previous story had left off, which nowadays, of course, is quite common. I mean, serialization of TV has almost become the norm. But back then in the 80s, this was quite rare, especially for a cartoon series for kids. So I thought this was the coolest thing when I was a kid, the idea of this one long continuing story. And I remember as a kid, because I didn't watch it every day. I wanted to watch it every day, but, you know, like my parents wouldn't let me watch TV all the time. And again, it was on most of the time when I was at school. I remember as a kid wanting to find out how the series ended, and getting some weeks where I knew I was watching like the final episodes in the story. Like you could tell it was building to a climax. And then we would always have like a family vacation, or I'd get in trouble. My dad wouldn't let me watch TV, and I couldn't watch it for 1 week. And then when I came back the next week, it was back at the beginning of the story again. So yeah, I never did find out how it ended as a kid, but I knew it was like this ongoing story. And I knew that once the story finished, they just started it again in syndication, which I guess they did for 4 years running on Nickelodeon. And I somehow had thought it was much longer. I was surprised to learn it was only 39 episodes. I mean, that means every 2 months they must have started it again. And Nickelodeon ran this show for about 4 years, according to Wikipedia. So yeah, they must have repeated the whole series over and over again, much more times than I realized. Yeah, there was a few different shows on Nickelodeon that actually were like this. Animated shows from Europe that had an ongoing storyline. Belle and Sebastian was, I think, the one that had the time slot right before the Mysterious Cities of Gold. But Belle and Sebastian I never really liked. That seemed to be targeted more at little kids. Mysterious Cities of Gold felt like the more... Well, it wasn't adult, it was a cartoon, but it felt like the more mature cartoon show, like the cartoon show that was treating its audience seriously, had higher stakes, had a more intricate story. It felt like the big kids cartoon show, where Belle and Sebastian was more of the little kids cartoon show. Anyways, all of that is to explain my fondness for this TV show growing up, and why some people my age are really big fans of this TV show, and some people my age never heard about it. But I discovered when I was living in Japan that this whole series was in my local video store in Japanese. And I had been at the time wanting to work my way through some Japanese TV shows, mainly for the language practice. I was trying to get more practice with my Japanese listening. And then I saw this show and I thought, I always wanted to see this whole thing as a child. And, you know, I get a bit nostalgic for things from my childhood like most people do. So I thought, and this will combine childhood nostalgia with my Japanese studies. Because, again, it was a French-Japanese co-production. So there was a Japanese version of it. In Japanese, the name is a little bit different. They call it Taiyo no Ko Esteban, which means Child of the Sun Esteban. But it's the same story. It's just all in Japanese. So I rented it from my local video store. It took me a few weeks to work my way through all 39 episodes. But I worked my way through all 39 episodes in the Japanese dub. Yeah, here I am with my review. I guess talking about the Japanese dub, first of all. And granted, this is only of interest to me because, most people watching this video will probably be familiar with the English dub, but I'm going to talk about this briefly. The theme song is really disappointing in the Japanese version. So I'm not going to try and sing it because I've got a terrible voice, but this is worth searching on YouTube for if you're not familiar with it. Put in the search bar Mysterious Cities of Gold theme song. Because the theme song for this was so cool. It just had like an air of like a mysterious song, and it seemed to like promise adventure and mystery. I remember as a kid really loving this theme song. And if you search the French version of the theme song, it's the exact same melody. And it sounds even cooler because, you know, it's in French, so kind of like a beautiful, mysterious language, French, right? I don't speak French myself, but I appreciate the sound of the language. So the French and the English versions of this theme song are really cool. Japanese, though, for whatever reason, they've got a completely different song that is just so terrible. It's just like this poppy J-pop song about like do your best, and it's just, I don't know why they didn't stick with the same theme song as the English and French versions. I don't know which one came out first, or I don't know. But yeah, the theme song is so terrible in the Japanese dub. The voice acting, though, is actually better in the original Japanese. I'm not sure how this compares to the French, because it was a Japanese-French co-production. But for comparison's sake, I went on the internet and I tracked down some copies of the English dub that I had watched as a kid. And I rewatched them, and the English dub is really not great. And this was something I never noticed as a kid, but it's got a few things going on. One is that apparently, for whatever reason, there's too much English dialogue to fit in the space. I guess this is a problem when you dub from one language to another language. It takes longer to say in English or whatever. So you always get the feeling that the voice actors are just rushing to finish their line before the character's mouth stops moving. And you know, this is something that's been parodied on South Park and stuff like that. You know, like watching Japanese anime with English dub. The characters are always talking really fast like this, right? Sorry, that was a bit of a bad impression, but you get the idea maybe. And the other thing as well is whatever English actors they got to do the dub on the English version are just sleepwalking through it. They're just saying all their lines with no emotion, like, oh no, oh let me go, oh Esteban, help me, just all in an almost monotone. So in that respect, the original Japanese voice actors are much better on this. Anyways, I'll stop talking about the Japanese language version because that was only of interest to me. I'll talk about the series as a whole now. I remember I was talking earlier about how as a child I viewed this as the more mature animated series as compared to like Belle and Sebastian, which was on the same network, which seemed more childish. It's interesting watching this as an adult because watching this as an adult, this does not seem mature to me at all. This seems distinctly aimed at the sensibilities of kids. Or in other words, it seems a bit childish. There's a few things going on. First of all, there's a lot of slapstick humor in this cartoon. Just kind of cartoonish slapstick humor, which seems clearly aimed at kids. As well, the comic relief characters, Sancho and Pedro, are just buffoons. It's not funny to adults, but it's funny to kids, I guess. The action sequences can be good, but physics are completely out the window. These are not realistic action sequences at all. These are cartoon action sequences. And when I say cartoon, I don't mean like Batman the Animated Series or like a more realistic cartoon. I mean almost like a Looney Tunes type cartoon feel to it. The whole premise of the show requires a suspension of disbelief. I mean, it is based on the old Spanish legend about the mysterious cities of gold. But then as they get further and further into the continent, they just more and more magical things keep happening. And you know, it's like that Indiana Jones thing, right? Where Indiana Jones finds all these ancient temples that have all this technology and booby traps. And you're like, okay, I'm going to go along with this. But really, people, they didn't have the technology to devise this elaborate booby traps 2,000 years ago. This show, The Mysterious Cities of Gold, is like that same suspension of disbelief, like times 100. There's all these ridiculous science fiction technologies that are embedded in this ancient civilization. And then the other thing that really marks this as a children's show is they're on this expedition, and there are 3 adults and there are 3 children, and the adults treat the children almost as equals, or they treat them as equals. Like when they need to make a decision, the adults will kind of turn to the children and say, okay, what do you think? And then the children are making all the decisions. And that's the kind of thing that, you know, children quite like those type of stories. I quite like that when I was watching this show as a child. But as an adult, when you watch it, you're like, oh, come on. They would not be asking the children what they thought at this stage. So it's something that's much easier to go along with when you're a child, and which strikes you as a little bit ridiculous when you're watching it as an adult. Nevertheless, all those complaints aside, this is so much better than any of that other junk we were watching in the 1980s. And this is especially notable. I mean, I know we all tend to remember the cartoons of our childhood fondly with rose-tinted glasses, or whatever the expression is. But, you know, if you go back and watch the Smurfs or Super Friends or an episode of He-Man or any of those cartoon shows we grew up with in the 80s, and you rewatch them now, they are terrible. Just unwatchable. This, though, The Cities of Gold, for all its faults and for all the elements that were childish, is really just a pleasure to watch. I mean, sure, I did have to suspend my adult reasoning at several points throughout the series, but the story is well written. It has a sense of exotic adventure that pervades the whole series, whether the characters are navigating the Straits of Magellan, or whether they're shipwrecked on the Galapagos Islands, or in the jungles of South America, or in the forests of the Amazon women, or deep in the cave of the Olmecs. The Olmecs is like this alien race that has caves in South America, and never mind about the Olmecs. But the point is, the whole series has this sense of just the best tradition of classic pulp fiction writers, just baked into the series. It's brilliant. I mean, it's completely ridiculous, but it's completely ridiculous in a very good way. It's just the best of exotic pulp fiction writing. The other noticeable thing about this, which I was really impressed by, again, watching this by an adult, is how surprisingly complex the characters are, especially by the standards of children's cartoons. So Mendoza, I don't know if you remember this, Mendoza was the big hero of the series. I mean, he wasn't really, because the children were the main characters, but he was the one who had the cape and would kind of swing in on the rope like a swashbuckler, and he had the sword, and he would get in the sword fights, and he would defend the children. And he was kind of, you know, like the hero of the show. And in any other children's TV show, he would be a paragon of moral virtue, and he'd always be, yeah, I mean, remember like how He-Man used to give morals at the end of the show, where he'd like turn to the camera and say, all right, now, children, what we learned today was there was just no moral complexity to the heroes of 1980s children's cartoons. But Mendoza was interesting. He actually, even though he was the guy who would always act like the hero, he did not always have the best interest of the children at heart. He was using the children to get to the cities of gold. And this was especially true at the beginning, and then his character arc was how he slowly became a better person. But he started out as a very flawed person. The children did not trust him, especially Zia did not trust him. And for most of the series, you did not know where his loyalties lie. And I had forgotten that whole aspect to it. I'd forgotten that there was some moral ambiguity to these characters, which was interesting in a children's series. And then, of course, the whole thing that this was an ongoing series, an ongoing story, which was really novel to us children of the 80s. So, in conclusion, this is not a perfect cartoon. It has its flaws, especially viewed from the perspective as an adult. But like, I think I was 8 years old when this was first airing on Nickelodeon in 1986. And you think, what a wonderful cartoon series this was for an 8-year-old boy. I mean, not great for an adult, granted, but for an 8-year-old boy, this was just a wonderful cartoon series. I'm glad I watched this when I was a kid, and it was fun to go back and revisit it, and to finally watch the whole thing from beginning to end, and see what the whole scope of it was. So, if you remember this series growing up, it might be interesting to check out now again that you're an adult. I mean, fair warning, some of it's not going to hold up as well, but a lot of it is still pretty interesting. If you've never seen this before, I don't know. It's probably too late to start now, huh? You might not see the appeal of it if you start watching it as an adult. But I don't know. Maybe watch just a couple episodes to get the flavor of it, because it does have an exotic, mysterious, fun flavor.